Associate Professor at Pontifical Catholic University in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and also a visiting researcher at the IOPPN at King's College London. His research focuses on self-awareness and metacognition in neurological and psychiatric disorders, particularly in dementia and related conditions. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Daniel Mograbi.
Thank you so much. It's a huge pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. Thank you, Vaughan and Jessica, for the invitation. Must confess it's a bit daunting to give this talk because I have both my PhD supervisor, Robin Morris, and one of my Vive examiners, Mike Kopelman, in the audience. So I fear if I don't give a decent talk, my PhD is going to be revoked. Let's see how it goes. I think it's important to define my terms, especially because the three of us were talking about awareness in very different ways. So what do I mean by self-awareness? Is the capacity of becoming the object of awareness. And I'm using this term in particular in relation to impaired self-awareness. So self-awareness in clinical groups and conditions in which you lose the capacity to know about yourself. This is well known in the neurological literature as anosognosia. In the psychiatric literature, there's loss of insight. Later in the talk, I'm going to be talking about self-awareness in broader terms as well. Most researchers believe that their topic of study is the most important thing ever, right? But in my case, it's actually true. It is, because it has been a quest for a species. It's a defining feature of the human condition. And just using two brief examples here, the Oracle of Delphi in Greece, cradle of Western civilization. You go there to know about your future. You're greeted by the words, know thyself. And in the Eastern tradition is a massive thing as well, self-awareness. So here's an example from Japan, but you have many others from India. But beyond the philosophical questions, what's the relevance of this theme? Essentially, from a clinical point of view, this has a lot of impact. Obviously, treatment compliance is affected if you're trying to take care of someone who does not recognize he or she has a difficulty. We were able to show that in relation to neuropsych rehab. So neuropsych rehab being affected by the level of awareness of a person with dementia across different outcomes, so cognition, but also mood and neuropsychiatric symptoms. It's also important from the point of view of patient safety because patients may engage in behaviors that are dangerous because they're doing things they're not capable of doing. And it has a massive impact in terms of caring as well, both at an individual level, caregiver burden, but also an increase in care costs. So it is very relevant in how can we approach this theme. And this is the cognitive awareness model, which was developed originally by Agnew and Morris in the last century. And but we've been doing revisions, and we've been talking now about a fourth version of the model. This is the latest version of the model. The fourth version is going to maybe encompass also somatic awareness, social awareness, so trying to develop this further. But what is the rationale behind the model? I'm not going into the details of the model, but it's essentially departing from clinical phenomena. We model this theoretically, and then we create testable predictions. We do empirical work. With the empirical work, we can refine the model and ideally also improve clinical care. So that's the general direction of the work. So just highlighting a few features of the model and showing how this sort of research plan can be achieved. One of the ideas here is that memory is important for self-awareness. This is quite obvious when we think about people with dementia. Many years ago, we coined this term, this metaphor, the petrified self, to talk about anosognosia in Alzheimer's disease. It's a metaphor. The idea here is that people with AD, they have an outdated sense of self. So it's quite solid, especially in the early stages of the condition. They can rely on that sense of self and sense of identity, but because of the anterograde amnesia, they don't update their sense of themselves. And a few years after the original paper, we saw how the evidence stacked in relation to the ideas there, and it's super nice to see independent groups supporting the general idea. Just showing some empirical data from independent groups, highlighting that, this lack of update of personal ability. So here we have work done by Chris Mullen and collaborators. The closer to zero, the more accurate people are. They're estimating their capacity, their ability after doing a task for a number of different memory training programs. At the very beginning, the first trial, participants are quite inaccurate regardless of the memory training program. With more trials, they become more accurate. They're responding to feedback. But then in a second visit, a week later, they reset to pretest in Lavos. And in the case of AD, this has been shown even with very short intervals, like half an hour, people reset to pretest in Lavos. That highlights this lack of update of personal ability. We have a submitted paper at the moment exploring that using EEG, using ERPs. So what we did, participants, they were doing a task, and we were measuring the feedback-related negativity on a trial-by-trial basis. So it's an ERP measuring reactions to feedback. Amplitude tends to be larger for negative feedback. We had a group of participants with AD, older and young adults. And as you can see here, it's a bit messy, but as you can see here, the amplitude is larger for all groups. So people with AD, on a trial-by-trial basis, are differentiating failure from success. But we also had questions of how well they were doing the task. Over 10, 100, and 500 trials, the EEG paradigms, you have to do like big number of trials, large number of trials, and then after 10 trials, we would ask, how well did you do over those 10 trials? There were no differences between groups because the information was still available then. Over 100 trials, we started to see a difference with people with AD being less accurate. Over 500 trials, they become even less accurate because the information is not available anymore. So that was the idea that we're trying to capture with this metaphor of the petrified self and this lack of update of personal ability. What else do we have in the model? The idea that we need metacognitive abilities and comparator mechanisms. Executive functions are really important to know how well you can do things. This has been shown also with EEG in different clinical groups. So you have EEGs dedicated to measuring awareness of errors. And as you can see here, this is a study with people with AD. The error-related negativity, it's preserved here in younger controls. It's here in older controls, but it's not here in AD patients. And as I said, this has been tested across clinical groups. This is a very recent paper. As you can see in schizophrenia, you also have reductions in this error monitoring ability. Very interesting to see how in order disorders, you have higher amplitude in the signal, in particular OCD, which kind of is related to the hypervigilance to errors of people with OCD and anxiety disorders in general. So it's an interesting marker as well of how aware people are of their condition, of their capacity to do things, and maybe even bringing this notion of hyper-awareness. The model also predicts some form of primary anosognosia. So the first thing that I mentioned was mnemonic anosognosia, then executive anosognosia, and then there is what we may call primary anosognosia. I think the rationale behind that was the idea of blind sight, but there's something different here because there's no center for awareness in our brains. So it doesn't make sense to have this module there is representing something else, what it may be representing. We can approach that from two very different angles. First one is top-down modulation. So even with fairly well-preserved cognitive abilities, you may be unable to acknowledge your difficulties because of a broader cultural factor, for instance. So culture is something that provides visibility or normalizes certain features of your experience. And we were able to test a bit of that. At the time, it was the largest study on awareness of memory ability in AD. It was across 3 continents, it was, or 3 regions, rather, people in India, China, and Latin America. Everyone had memory problems because back then it was DSM-4 criteria, so all participants had memory impairment as measured by neuropsych testing. And the prevalence of unawareness was super high, so up to 72% of patients didn't acknowledge memory difficulties, and it was higher in India. And the interesting feature there is that we did another study in which we were asking participants. This was, awareness here was measured by comparing participant self-report and neuropsych testing, but we had another study in which we compare with a carer report. And the carers in India were also unaware of the difficulties of the people living with dementia, which suggests this broader contextual factor. So this is something that may impact self-awareness as well. The other idea for this primary unawareness or nosognosia is that maybe a problem in integration of information. And there's work from Audrey Peretin and colleagues showing how a nosognosia in AD may be linked to disconnection between the hippocampus and the orbitofrontal cortex. We did a small study with DTI because no one had done DTI and awareness in Alzheimer's disease. And although the findings are not earth-shattering, we're able to show that there are some associations with DTI metrics and unawareness in AD. So that does support this general idea. What else do we have in the model? There is this interesting feature, which I think for clinicians is particularly relevant, which is this implicit arm of the model. And that was the theme of my PhD. There is this phenomenon that we decided to term and use this idea of implicit awareness. It is an oxymoron. If it's awareness, it's not implicit, right? But that's exactly what we're trying to capture. The idea of people who may know that they have a difficulty without openly acknowledging that difficulty. And clinically, that has been observed many, many times. You may see people with neurological disorders making symbolic references to their condition, although they say that they're fine, or people deciding to stay in hospital, a dissociation between what they say and their behavior. They take the medication, they stay in hospital. People with anosognosia for hemiplegia, with mesoplegia, showing hatred towards the limb, although they say that they can still move their arm. So there are many ways to explore that. We did a recent study which kind of touches not necessarily on the implicit aspect, but how you can probe people in relation to their difficulties, which was using figurative language. So instead of asking something like, do you have memory problems? Just saying something, has your memory been letting you down? And merely by rephrasing things, we saw some modulations depending on the object of awareness. So in particular activities of daily living, it was easier for participants to acknowledge their difficulties if we use indirect language. This has also been submitted. But we can explore that also in relation to emotional reactivity, which I think is very interesting and productive. And that was one of my PhD papers. We use tasks with control levels of difficulty here. So it's a success-failure manipulation. So the tasks were either too easy or too hard for participants. We knew before how well they would do because it was being controlled by the program. And what we saw is that with the controls, they tended to underestimate abilities slightly, regardless of whether the task was hard or easy. Maybe out of politeness, they didn't want to say that they did 90%, they got 90% of trials, they would say 80%. This was done in the UK. The results from Brazil are slightly different. And we were also measuring emotional reactivity, both in terms of self-report and filming of facial expressions. So the controls here, when they estimate their ability, they slightly underestimate how well they did. People with AD, they have this swing, which is very interesting. When they're talking about their failure, they say that they did way better than they actually did, which is this classic marker of an awareness of performance. But also, they underestimate their success. And that's very relevant because it shows there's no positive bias. It's not psychological denial. You wouldn't need a defense mechanism for something that you did well. It's truly a neurocognitive factor. We were the first ones to actually explore awareness of success because that's a massive bias in the literature. People explore awareness of failure typically. The interesting thing is that the emotional reactivity is similar across groups. So although the Alzheimer's group is unaware of their capacity to do the task, in terms of emotional reactivity, they're similar to controls. Doing research in Brazil, you end up having interesting opportunities because it's a very different research environment. So here in the UK, you tend to specialize. In Brazil, because of a lack of critical mass of research, you tend to generalize. So at some point, someone's going to knock at your door and say, do you want to do research into bipolar disorder? And you say, yes, of course, why not? And it was interesting because I was already developing ideas with Robin in relation to the relationship between mood and awareness. There is this very strong association between impaired self-awareness and apathy. We saw a bit of that in the talk earlier today. And why does that happen? Potentially because apathy may lead to affective blunting. So we may deprive errors from their affective signature. So if you're apathetic, you do something, you don't do something well, you're not going to feel that negative feeling that is going to be so important to be able to record that experience. Maybe also apathy prevents you from engaging in activities. Maybe it's more this motivational aspect that you're not doing things because you're not engaging with the world, you don't get prompted about your difficulties. And also there is an association across clinical conditions between depression and self-awareness. I remember as a first-year PhD student, Tony David saying that with the law of gravity of insight, if your insight goes up, your mood goes down. So that's very consistent. It's across clinical conditions, what may be happening there. Well, one idea is maybe it's depressive realism. Typically we have positive biases and then we lose our positive biases. Or maybe it's just a negative bias. Maybe it's just for negative objects of awareness, for something like performance in a failure task. If you're depressed, it may look like you're more aware, but you're just being negative about yourself. So this may affect how you express yourself, how you record and represent experiences, and also how you retrieve memories. There may be some sort of mood congruent effect as well there in your memory recollection. And we were able to do some research with bipolar, and I'll just highlight two studies. We did quite a few, but I think this one I find very interesting because it took us almost 2 years to have close to 50 people who were going through the 4 different states that you may have in bipolar disorder, not only the classic 3, but also the mixed state. It's a natural experiment on the relationship between mood and awareness, because you have the same person. It's very neat design, because within subjects, it's the same person. The only thing that is changing is actually the mood state, and then you can see how it fluctuates, and it goes like that. When you're in euthymia, you have awareness of your condition, and then when you're in mania, this is loss of insight. So when you're in mania, you lose insight. When you're in depression, back with awareness. And we were surprised because we thought the mixed state would be somewhere in between. No, apparently if you have a bit of mania, that's sufficient for you to lose insight. We also did another study, which I like, which is over 100 people with bipolar, but in this case, not only they were in euthymia and mania, but also we explore polarity. So polarity is when people have more than 2/3 of their episodes of a certain type. So in this case, half of the patients had, or it was split, it was a 2x2 design in which people were euthymia with undefined polarity, so well-balanced number of episodes, euthymia with manic polarity, in mania with undefined polarity, and in mania with manic polarity. And the polarity was irrelevant, as was the number of previous episodes. So what I find interesting about this, the data here, is that it shows that it's your current mood state and not what has happened before. So whatever changes are mediated by mood in your self-awareness, they're transient. They're not permanent. So. Okay, but natural experiments are very cool, but there's something cooler, an actual experiment that's always cooler because you're manipulating the variables. So we did that with people with Alzheimer's disease. So again, people were doing those tasks with control levels of difficulty. It was either easy or hard. And then we're asking about their awareness before and after. Awareness in broader terms, not only awareness about the task, but anosognosia in general, if they could acknowledge their deficits. We were trying to see here, explore that mood congruent hypothesis. If they're slightly frustrated, is it going to be easier for them to acknowledge that they have a condition? Is this maybe an issue of access to memories? Because that could be a good explanation for mania as well. You lose insight in mania because potentially you cannot access certain memories about certain negative memories. What we found was I would say, even more interesting because they completed reaction time tasks, and they would get more frustrated after the reaction time task, but there was no difference in terms of their awareness of their condition. But when it came to the memory tasks, then not only they had the drop in emotional reactivity, more negative emotions, but they improved their awareness. So to me, that shows that it's not only mood-congruent memory, it's context-dependent memory. It's not any failure that's going to help them know that they have difficulties. It's failure in something that is related to their condition. In this case, Alzheimer's disease and memory. And in relation to the apathy, although it's just a correlation, in relation to the apathy, the change in anosognosia, the improvement in anosognosia, correlated negatively with apathy. So people who had more apathy, they couldn't have this emotional impact of doing the failure task and improve their self-awareness. Great. I said that I've been working towards this broader, I think, definition of self-awareness. This is more recent work. And this is something that I've done with John and Hugh Critchley, this taxonomy to try to explore self-awareness. And we're thinking about self-awareness as the result of different processes. So you can have self-awareness linked to your interoception, potentially. So it's knowing about what's happening inside your body, but also body ownership and proprioception, that's another important feature. Agency, knowing that you're responsible for your actions. And then more narrative forms of self-awareness, metacognition, emotional regulation. Metacognition and emotional regulation are the same thing, just linked to different objects. It's information and strategies, knowledge, how to modulate either cognition or emotions. So they're very, very similar. And of course, autobiographical memory. And we're exploring how this can be seen in terms of clinical expressions in people with dementia. And what I think is that about this taxonomy is that it may be helpful not only to expand our notion of self-awareness, but also we have work that we're doing now, theoretical work with Valentina Pacella from Bordeaux, trying to go from there back to anosognosia as well. And in terms of modeling, the general idea is that maybe we can think about self-awareness as an emergent property, and that property would be linked to two different types of self-awareness: bodily self-awareness and self-representations, more narrative self-awareness. And maybe in the bodily self-awareness aspect of the model, we can have processes nested in hierarchical fashion, with interoception being at the core of everything, with different contributions of other processes. Again, this is not an exercise in funny drawings. The idea here is to generate testable hypotheses, refine those models, and try to improve clinical care, and also from this, maybe use some of these ideas for the new version of the cognitive awareness model. And what I think is interesting also about this sort of taxonomy is that we can expand that taxonomy from one condition to another, and maybe work in a transdiagnostic manner, which it has been a passion of mine recently. I know that when you talk about a transdiagnostic approach and from psychiatrists, you never know what's going to be their reaction. Obviously, those categories, they were invented by us. We only have phenotypes, right? So that's quite obvious. So that's the drive behind those approaches, however faulty they may be. But I quite like thinking about this taxonomy of self-awareness and linking this taxonomy to different conditions. And then you can see there is a lot of shared space between those conditions. And then maybe we can think about disorders of self-awareness using this sort of framework and see how certain conditions are close to each other. So this may help us eliminating shared features of those conditions as well. So that's the general idea, the general drive of this sort of extended framework. We've been doing now some empirical research with people with depression, and it's interesting to see how this is already proven to be something productive. So that's the general drive now. We're going to move towards that and maybe incorporate some of those elements in the cognitive awareness model. Right, a bit of an advertisement. It's not always that I'm giving a talk abroad, so I have to use this as an opportunity to not only talk about the lab, but to highlight how important it is for researchers in developing regions to establish collaborations with colleagues from high-income countries. It makes a huge difference. We were able to keep our lab in the past few years essentially with bilateral funding, money from different countries, from the US, from the UK, and because of the currency exchange differences, it makes such a huge difference. Even a small grant makes such a huge difference. And the weather is nicer there, as you can see. Much nicer. Those are pictures from my mobile. It's not even a good mobile. It's a really bad one. This is just right. This is my commute. I'm not joking. This is my commute. Okay? This is my commute. So do get in touch with us if you have any interest in those themes. We even have funding to bring you there. So do get in touch with us. It makes such a huge difference for us. And it allows us to try to keep our research output at an international level. And that makes also a huge difference socially. Great. That's it for me. I'd like to thank participants and their families. They're the reason of our work, collaborators, and the funding agencies, of course.
Thank you, Dr. Mograbi. Time for 2 questions. If they could be fairly concise, that would be wonderful. Oh, sorry. Leon, the father. Thank you.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for the excellent talk. I was just wondering, so your nice framing of the bipolar disorder studies and the sort of natural experiment and the only thing changing in these states is mood. I suppose, give me a second. The most important bit is the bit that will be amplified, so that's good. Is it really the case that it's only mood that's changing between those states? Because there are cognitive difficulties that are obviously occur in bipolar, and they might not, and some of them persist, and some of them might be more sort of state-specific. But I wondered if you looked at that and could speak to maybe the sources of...
True, fair point. Maybe what I meant was that the most important thing that is changing is mood, and then everything else is changing because of mood. So maybe that was what I meant by that. But we have looked into cognitive correlates of loss of insight in bipolar disorder. I didn't show that particular paper, but there were, apart from clinical correlates such as mania symptomatology being like the most important predictor, performance in attention testing was quite relevant as well in regression models controlling for the effect of mania. So somewhat independent contribution of attention to insight in bipolar. So yes, there are some cognitive correlates, but primarily what is...
They're also quite important to some patients, I think.
Yeah. Primarily, I would say, yeah, but primarily, I think it's driven by mood. That's why I meant, driven by mood.
I don't know who to give the mic back to.
Any more questions from the audience, either in person or online?
Daniel, thank you. It was a really fascinating talk. I was really fascinated by the findings you have on culture and kind of insight differences across culture. How much might that be down to language, do you think? Or, you know, the question is about what might the mechanisms be. I'm aware that in some languages you say, I forgot, I dropped something, and in other languages you say, it escaped me and it fell away from me. And the extent to which, you know, these differences may turn up in terms of insight. Yeah,
no, I think it can definitely be modulated by language, and we do have, it's an interesting topic, right? Having a word for something, how much does it mediate your relationship with that object? So Portuguese speakers, they talk a lot about this word saudade, which is, you have that in different languages as well, which is essentially saying that you miss someone, but there's a word for that, and then you can create a culture around that. That's what the Portuguese sailors did, and Portuguese poetry was built around that, and then, of course, it came to Brazil. So having, the words, they were important. Also interesting to understand in the context of that study how questions can be interpreted. Because the question was, do you think you have memory problems? And when we talked to colleagues in India about the results, they said that that was the main issue there, was the memory problems. Maybe the person was willing to acknowledge that the memory changed, but not that that was necessarily a problem. So they were normalizing that not as a problem, but as age-related change, which is not the case because we're talking about people with dementia, but it's a different approach as well. And another angle to that also was the position of older people in Indian society. So we're talking about extended families living together, so you wouldn't be disrespectful towards like the eldest person in the house. So that's another idea as well.
Fascinating, thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you. So thank you to all our speakers for such a stimulating and fascinating